It was meant to be a quiet goodbye. Harold Jameson, a 79-year-old war veteran, came to St. Mary's Church to bury his wife, the woman he had loved for over 50 years. He wore his old army jacket, walked slow with cane, and carried her urn in both hands. There was no crowd, no music, just silence and sorrow. But that cold morning turned into something no one expected. As Harold stepped out his truck, a young police officer confronted him about parking too close to the entrance. Harold tried to explain, but the officer grew impatient. Within seconds, the officer grabbed the old man and slammed him to the ground, right there in front of the church and his wife's funeral. What followed, just 6 minutes later, would silence the town. Veterans from every branch began arriving, parking their bikes, standing shoulder to shoulder around their fallen brother. They didn't yell. They didn't threaten. They stood in silence, tall, proud, unshaken. What happened that day wasn't just about Harold. It was a reminder. When one of our own is disrespected, we show up. Always. Because brotherhood doesn't end when the war is over. It lives on. Harold Jameson was 79 years old. He walked slowly with cane and wore a faded army jacket that had long molded to his frame. It wasn't about pride. It wasn't for show. That jacket held pieces of his life that only he understood. On that cold morning, he didn't come to impress anyone. He came to bury the woman who had been his anchor through war, peace, and everything in between. Her name was Margaret. They had met in 1969, just before Harold shipped off to Vietnam. She was quiet, warm, and kind, the kind of woman who waited without complaint and prayed every night that the man she loved would come home alive. He did, but not whole. The war had left scars on his body and shadows in his mind. Nightmares came often. Words came slow. But Margaret stayed. She stayed through the silence, the restless nights, the bad days when Harold barely recognized himself in the mirror. She never left his side. For over 50 years, Margaret had been more than a wife. She had been his compass. She kept him steady when the past tried to pull him under. And now she was gone. That morning at St. Mary's Church, Harold moved with the stiffness of old wounds and grief. In his arms, he held the wooden box that carried Margaret's ashes. It was light in weight, but heavy in every other way. Each step he took toward the church doors felt longer than a mile. Inside, the room was still. There were no choirs, no crowds, just a handful of old friends, a pastor, and a flag-draped table waiting at the front. Harold placed the urn gently down, then stood at the edge of the casket. On top of it, folded with military precision, was a flag, red, white, and blue, full of meaning. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles white. That flag had draped his own brothers in arms, men he watched fall in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Now it covered Margaret, the last person who ever truly knew all of him. He didn't cry, not out loud, but behind those tired eyes, every memory was flooding back. The day he left for basic training, the letters she wrote, the way she looked waiting for him at the bus station in 1971. Her hands, her voice, the way she said his name like it was a promise. Harold stood in silence, letting the weight of 50 years press down on him all at once. He was a soldier, yes, but more than that, he was a husband saying goodbye. He didn't want speeches. He didn't want comfort. All he wanted was to hold that flag a little longer, like it was the last piece of Margaret he had left. People watched from the pews, quiet and respectful. They didn't move. They didn't interrupt. In that moment, Harold's grief was a sacred thing, something too deep for words, too raw for anyone to touch. That jacket he wore, tore at the cuffs, frayed at the collar, had seen combat, funerals, births, and long nights spent by Margaret's hospital bed. It carried the smell of old leather and time, but also carried stories of sacrifice, love, and endurance. As the pastor began the short reading, Harold didn't sit. He kept his hand on the flag, head slightly bowed. The words echoed faintly in the high ceiling, but Harold wasn't really hearing them. He was somewhere else, back on the porch of their first home, back in a hospital room when Margaret held his hand and told him, "It's okay, you can let go." But he hadn't let go. Not yet, maybe not ever. Outside, the wind picked up. A group of older men stood near the entrance, some in leather jackets, others with pins and patches from wars past. They had come for Harold, not because he asked, he never would, but because that's what brothers do. Inside, the ceremony moved on, but Harold didn't move. His cane rested beside the table. His hand stayed firm on the flag. No one rushed him. No one dared. For those few minutes, time itself seemed to stop, honoring not just Margaret's life, but the quiet, weathered man who had loved her through a lifetime of war and peace. And as a final prayer was spoken, Harold whispered something under his breath, a goodbye only Margaret would understand. The room remained still, held in the silence of true love and old pain. And in that silence, Harold Jameson stood tall, not as a soldier, not even as a husband, but as a man who had given everything and loved even more. Frank sat silently in the back seat of the police cruiser, his wrists still bound tightly in the cold steel cuffs. His hands, whether from decades of labor and war, now rested limply on his lap. The ceremonial sword had been left lying on the grass beside the sidewalk. The American flag, which had meant so much to him and his son, was creased and dirty, trampled in the scuffle. He closed his eyes. Outside, the sounds of the funeral faded into the distance. The procession was moving on without him, his only boy being lowered into the ground, and he wasn't there. He could barely breathe. His chest felt heavy, not from anger, but from a grief too wide to name. Then it happened. 10 minutes after Frank was arrested, the distant rumble of engines broke the stillness. At first, it was just one, then two, then more. Heads turned. People stopped mid-step. A caravan of military vehicles. 2 Humvees in front, followed by a black van and a pair of troop carriers, pulled into the narrow road that led into the cemetery. The vehicles moved slowly but deliberately. From the first Humvee, a young Army officer stepped out, tall and composed. His dress uniform was spotless, his boots polished, his face stern. The name tag read Rodriguez. Captain. He had served with Tyler Delaney. He was there not just for the funeral. He was there for something else. Captain Rodriguez walked directly toward the police cruiser, flanked by 2 other uniformed soldiers. Mourners stepped aside. Veterans stood up straighter. The young captain didn't hesitate. He knocked on the driver's side window. The officer behind the wheel cracked it open, cautious. "I'm Captain Miguel Rodriguez," he said calmly. "I serve under Lieutenant Tyler Delaney. This man in your custody, he's a father of the soldier being buried today. Release him." The officer frowned. "Sir," he was carrying a weapon. "We were following protocol." Rodriguez didn't blink. He pulled a laminated ID from his pocket and held it up. "Under Military Funeral Honors Law, Title 10, Section 1491, we are authorized to conduct full military rites. This includes uniform standards and ceremonial items. That sword is not a weapon. It's part of his uniform, and he is entitled to wear it." The officer hesitated. "I still need to check with." Before he could finish, 2 more Humvees rolled up. Soldiers began exiting the vehicles, 20, maybe more, all of them in full dress, all of them moving with quiet purpose. They formed a line along the road, shoulder to shoulder, facing the cruiser, silent, motionless, imposing. Rodriguez lowered his voice, but made sure the officer could hear every word. "You've already embarrassed this man. You've already shamed a father on the worst day of his life. Do not make it worse. Release him." A long pause. Then, without another word, the officer opened the back door. The second officer moved to Frank and unlocked the cuffs. Frank didn't move at first. He looked up at Rodriguez, then at the line of soldiers standing guard on the road. Rodriguez extended a hand. Frank took it, slowly, as if still unsure whether he was dreaming. He stepped out, unsteady, the pain in his shoulder from being forced down earlier now throbbing. One of the young soldiers came forward and picked up the ceremonial sword from the grass, brushing off the dirt. Another soldier retrieved the folded flag. They handed both to Frank with a salute. He returned it with trembling fingers. Captain Rodriguez stood beside him. "We'll walk with you, Sergeant. You won't finish this alone." Together, they turned and began the slow walk toward the burial site. Frank, flanked by a line of young soldiers, moved 1 step at a time, each footfall deliberate. The silence around them was powerful. The officers remained where they were, now unsure themselves, watching the men they once dismissed march past with more dignity than any courtroom could deliver. As they neared the casket, the honor guard stood at attention. Tyler's fellow soldiers, eyes sharp and full of sorrow, saluted Frank. Frank stopped just short of the grave. He clutched the flag against his chest, looked down at the wooden casket that bore his son's name. His voice, hoarse and cracked, barely escaped his lips. "I just wanted to say goodbye to my boy." And the whole cemetery seemed to stand still, holding its breath for a father's grief, a soldier's honor, and a nation's silent apology. Frank stood at the edge of the grave, the polished casket before him draped in the stars and stripes. The folded flag he had just received was clutched tightly in his arms, held against his chest as though it might somehow hold back the pain that threatened to overwhelm him. Around him, the air was still. The other mourners had taken a respectful distance, watching quietly as the father of a fallen soldier said goodbye. The ceremony continued. A military chaplain stepped forward, offering solemn words about sacrifice, duty, and legacy. The soldiers performed a rifle volley. 3 sharp bursts into the open sky. A lone bugler played taps, the mournful tune echoing across the cemetery grounds, each note rising like smoke from a battlefield long past. Frank didn't move. His lips barely parted as he whispered something to the casket, to the son he had raised and lost. "You were always brave. I just hope I was the kind of father you needed me to be." He stood there long after the last salute. Some came to offer condolences. Others simply placed a hand on his shoulder. No words were needed. The line of soldiers who had escorted him remained nearby, at ease now, but still silent, their presence a living shield of respect. The news spread quickly. Someone had recorded the earlier incident. The video showed everything: the cuffs, the kneeling, the sword on the ground. It went viral. By that evening, cable news anchors were recounting the story. A decorated Marine veteran arrested at his own son's funeral for wearing the sword he'd earned the right to carry. Veteran organizations from across the country issued statements of outrage. Former service members flooded social media with support. Hashtags trended. Letters were written. Petitions were signed. Even retired generals weighed in. 1 week later, the local police department held a press conference. The chief looked stiff and uncomfortable as he read from a prepared statement. "We regret the actions taken by our officers at the National Cemetery last week. It is clear that mistakes were made in interpreting the law. We extend our deepest apologies to Mr. Frank Delaney and his family for the distress caused." Frank watched the clip from his living room, sitting in the quiet house where Tyler's photos still lined the mantel. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He turned off the television. He hadn't asked for an apology. He hadn't needed one. To him, the only thing that mattered was that he'd been able to walk with honor beside his son one last time, that the sword had been placed back in his hands, that he had stood not alone, but surrounded by young men and women who still understood what service meant. Frank returned to the cemetery the following Sunday, not for a ceremony, not for show, just to sit by Tyler's headstone. He brought a folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and the old flag again. He sat in silence for over an hour. Birds chirped. Wind rustled the grass. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just sat. When he finally rose, he placed the flag down beside the stone for a moment and offered a slow, deliberate salute. He whispered, "I'll be back next week. Got some stories to tell you." As he walked back to his truck, he passed another family visiting a grave. A boy, no more than 12, watched Frank with wide eyes, then turned to his father and asked, "Was he a real soldier?" The man nodded. "Yes, that's what honor looks like." Frank didn't hear the exchange, but he felt something in the air, a kind of stillness that comes when dignity is finally restored. He drove home slowly, not because he was tired, but because he wanted to take it all in. The sunlight through the trees, the scent of early spring, the simple hum of the engine beneath him. Sometimes honor isn't just in the medals. It's in the quiet salute of those who remember. If today's story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel to help us honor and share the powerful memories of those who have quietly sacrificed. Every subscription, every comment you leave is a heartfelt tribute to the soldiers, the fathers, and the families who endured loss with unwavering dignity. Share your thoughts below. We're always listening. And remember, sometimes honor isn't found in medals, but in the quiet bow of those who still remember.